Hi, it's with great pleasure that I welcome today one of my colleagues from King's College London and to an ORF platform to discuss his latest book, a book which I must concede is an excellent read, a pacey read, and yet manages to speak to so many of the contemporary issues that we face today. A book that uses historical lens and yet demystifies for us some of the geopolitical challenges that the world faces. And I think also a book that manages to talk about an issue that is often not very fashionable to talk about, in a manner that is very agnostic about empires and imperialism. And I think that's one of the most interesting parts of this book. So I have with me today Dr. Samir Puri from King's College London, who is also affiliated with Johns Hopkins, and with his latest book, The Great Imperial Hangover: How Empires Have Shaped the World. Already making waves across empires, I'm told. So welcome, Samir, to ORF, and thank you for giving us your time today.
Harsh, thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you, of course, to the ORF for the platform to have this wonderful and timely conversation. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just start with a very basic question. I'm sure you would have, this question would have been done to death as far as you are concerned. But what drove you to this project? Because I recall and I remember that your previous books have been largely on South Asia, Pakistan, counterterrorism. Your work has been around that issue. And of course, statues are toppling around us. New empires are being built, formal and informal. But when you would have started this project, it would have been much earlier. So what drove you to this idea that empires as something that are shaping our geopolitical consciousness today is a good idea to just discover and evaluate?
Yeah, I never tire of answering this question because it speaks to so many of the dilemmas that we're facing in domestic and international politics. There's two reasons, Harsh. One is professional, the other is personal. Professionally, the last job I did when I used to work for the UK Foreign Office was a year in East Ukraine, where I was seconded to an international body to monitor the onset of the conflict involving Russia and the territory of East Ukraine. This is 2014-15, and I'm sure you'll agree, coming off the back of 15 years by that point of post-9/11 rhetoric around wars on terror, around terrorism, before I got there, as soon as I read the MH17 Malaysian airliner had been shot down, it was unbelievable, unbelievably tragic, but unbelievable in what it seemed to convey, which was the return of great power competition in a way that we'd always said, will it come back? Won't it come back? Will it come back from China? But it came back, I think, most viscerally in that 2014-15 period in relation to Russia. Shortly after that was, of course, the Brexit vote in the UK. And it left me thinking that often we analyse imperial legacies in a tunnel vision of how they've impacted one country, one nation, one region. People become quite enraptured by their own dilemmas and their own culture wars. But it struck me that without trying to seek false equivalents, saying something very simple, which is the age of empires ended over the course of the 20th century, and then using that as a point of departure to look at the multitude of dilemmas that different parts of the world face in how they have reinterpreted and adapted to the end of the age of formal empires, struck me as quite an interesting start point. So the book is comparative in that regard. That's the professional reason. The personal reason is that as we always know, the most important things we inherit in our attitudes, it's not so much globalization, it's not even so much what we read on the internet, it's from our immediate past. It's how we're brought up, it's what our parents tell us as we grow up, the circumstances in which we're raised. And mine personally, my family is from Punjab a couple of generations ago, then thanks to the British Empire, or no thanks, depending on your interpretation of it, they ended up in Kenya and Tanzania, my grandparents and parents. Then, of course, I was born in London. 3 generations, 3 continents, empire is the backstory behind some of that migration. I wanted to fuse the political and geopolitical questions and conundrums that we all face and that your esteemed institution is at the forefront of analysing in Asia, with that sense of personal inheritance. How is it that we form the opinions that we form? How is it that some publics are possibly vulnerable to being captured by a demagogue who's appealing to a distant past, sometimes quite a mythical past, to mobilize that population behind whether it's a massive political rupture, as in Brexit, whether it's a return to a mythical past that is India with Modi and the people surrounding him, or whether it's with Vladimir Putin and an allusion to Russian imperial greatness and how that can be used to rhetorically justify the actions he's taking. So really it's that fusion of the personal and the professional. And I think the last comment on that, Harsh, is that it's quite liberating to write from a personal experience perspective rather than a purely theoretical. It's not a theoretical book, and I think your introduction spoke very directly to that, and thank you for your kind comments. It's really a book written in plain English, but covering much of the world, and hopefully acting as a good primer for both experts and non-experts to understand why it is there is frankly so many misunderstandings and bitterness within countries and between countries. It feels like we're regressing sometimes. I'm sure most of us would agree with that.
No, I think absolutely. It's a very, very timely book, and it's striking almost, how many issues it's speaking to that we are, grappling with in our day-to-day, whether it's policy debates or whether it's even academic debates. But I must, before I come to the substance of the book, I must ask you this, because were you a bit scared when you took upon this subject, the imperialism, the history of imperialism? I mean, there is an entire industry in academia that is very proprietary about this. They don't allow outsiders to enter this debate, and there are very strong ideological lines being driven. So I would be very scared to dabble into that, but you are a very brave man. So were you at all conscious of this fact that you are entering into territory that is already being very, very clearly defined in some ways? People have very distinct, academics in particular, have very distinct positions on this issue, and therefore the point of view that you were representing and which you are representing in this book might come as from a vantage point which perhaps, of course, it's a very nuanced perspective. It allows for a greater discussion to happen about imperialism, about empires, but also makes your life as an academic more difficult, dealing with other academics who dabble in this, whether as a historian or whether as a political scientist.
Well, brave or naive is the answer to that question. And there's a little bit like, you'll know this with starting a new project. You are sort of setting sail without necessarily knowing where the coast of your arrival is. I mean, that's the fun of writing, of research, of intellectual exploration. There's no point setting out if you know exactly where you're going to go. And I set out with one mantra in mind, which was not to pick an angry polemical position one way or the other. Because the first thing you notice when you mention empire and legacies is how polarizing even the mere mention of it becomes, because it speaks to identity and heritage as much as it does how we feel when we open the newspapers or look at our news feeds and see the latest development around the world. It's very personal. And so there's a community of people that we know who ascribe modernity to the way in which the empires of the 20th century in particular laid some of the proto sort of fiber optic wires of globalization. Then, of course, the post-colonialists are virulently angry with regards to anything that empire has touched and focus more specifically on imperial era repression and massacres, which certainly occurred. We're seeing that now in the UK and the US very viscerally, where both sides, both polarized sides, are basically on a collision course with each other, both around the politics of historical memory, but also how that then speaks to contemporary debates around African Americans or Black British people's position in society relating back to slavery, so on and so forth. So the bravery in the undertaking was try to strike a path that is not picking one side or the other, but simply saying that the unresolvable nature of those debates is the substance of our world. And if the thesis of the book, we'll come to that in a moment, can be summed up, it's not that we're entering a new imperial age, it's that the world consists of many clashing post-imperial visions and identities. And these are, in many respects, unresolvable. There was no squaring the circle that's going to be had. There's no moment when we're going to all agree to disagree about the past and just move on. It will continue to divide communities within countries and between countries. and precipitate the most catastrophic, in some cases, misunderstandings and collision courses.
Yes, so let's come to the main thesis of this, which I think partly you've articulated already. But in a sense, our history is a history of rise and fall of empires, and how they have shaped our consciousness about our own past, and perhaps indelibly shaped our future. So in that sense, were you aware of this project as one that would speak to contemporary realities? Because all your chapters are partly historical and partly, when you look at what is happening today in today's world, and how this imperial debates are sort of allowing us to re-evaluate some of our policy options of the day. So in a sense, were you aware when you were writing this, this massive book covering almost the entire world, that this is the structure that you want to follow, and therefore the central thesis that would emerge would be one of colliding imperial legacies and how they shape contemporary environment? Or that was that something that emerged out of the project itself?
Yeah, I think it speaks to my own instinct as being somebody who doesn't want to become angry about the problems we're facing in the world, but wants to understand them. And there are enough people who are taking very specific polemical positions, and we'll come to some of those a bit later as we talk about the specifics, I'm sure. But the idea of I call it balance sheet of empire history, in which you say, with regards to, for example, the British Empire, thinking about Kenya or India, you think, well, there's the Mau Mau rebellion and repression, there's the Amritsar massacre, but then there's the railways. And it depends on how people weight things, and speaks more to where their natural sympathies lie. You either end up as Neil Ferguson, or you end up as Shashi Tharoor, if I can pick again two quite famous examples of picking the evidence, in effect, to support that conclusion around the sins or the regrettable advances of empire, depending on your position. So the structure of the chapters I designed quite carefully to speak to, as you said, much of the world, and certainly parts of the world that I've either worked in or, as mentioned, have had some family connection to or have studied in my PhD. And to try to present in as even-handed way as you possibly can the fact that the imperial histories that part of the world looks back to and speaks to, it's like an abstract painting. And with that sort of selectivity in mind, you can more or less pick most justificatory arguments for present-day actions from what you see there. You can either say that great weakness makes us vulnerable, therefore we need to be strong. You might say that our attempts to be strong in the past must make us humble. Political entrepreneurs all around the world can find almost infinite amounts of evidence to support the sorts of cases that they want to make, but only some of them will press the right buttons in enough of that domestic population to actually sound credible. So that was really the intention with the structure of the book. I think that sort of the last thing I'd say in terms of the structure is I wanted to keep each chapter quite discreet, and to say, well, these are 8 chapters looking at different countries or regions, and whether empire touched them because their forebears were the imperialists, or whether empire touched them because their immediate forebears had been colonized and subjugated, or, as is usual across history, some mixture of these particular experiences. Empire has been experienced, legacies of empire are prevalent. How does it then affect the present? Going back to your question, it is about the present. My PhD is political science. I did a history undergraduate degree. So I'm coming at this not to replace the archival histories or the strong narrative histories that we rely on for understanding the world. It's to try to summarize some of those and then move it more or less straight away to the present day policy debates and challenges around why it is we feel that globally we're in this era of transformation, rise of China, so on and so forth, shift to Asia, the uncertainty around America, and also domestically why this recourse to history, whether it's populists in Eastern Europe, in India, in their own manifestation, in America, why it is that they are also subconsciously, sometimes consciously, drawing upon this, dipping into this well of unresolved tensions and hatreds and antipathies that go back into that nation's history.
So you say, for example, that future is an era of interplay between many competing imperial visions. And I think that's, in a sense, the fundamental challenge that we are facing today, trying to grapple with what is coming next. I mean, there's so much happening, and few of us would have anticipated, perhaps even 5 years back, that this would be the phase that would be passing through. So clearly, when you look at this interplay of competing visions, there are two very big visions that are being talked, that are being articulated, and that are in contestation. So let's start with the American version. Now, America has, I think you also point this out in your book, has been so much part of our consciousness that I think there are very few people aware of a period before America was not a global power. So today we live in a world which is defined in some ways by American legacy as an informal empire, as an empire that perhaps, as a nation, as a great power that contests imperialism, but at the same time is almost shaping every part of the world almost as an imperial power. It's so that juxtaposition, that contrast where America talks about itself, as about its manifest destiny as an indispensable nation, and that is something that American policymakers often do with a nonchalance that is expected perhaps of a nation that is almost unaware of its impact around the world. So when you look at America today, and when you look at Mr. Trump, and when you look at the inward-looking orientation of America, this debate between how much America should engage globally, do you see the imperial legacy being framed directly in these conversations, or are there some intervening variables? For example, the globalization debate that perhaps allowed Mr. Trump to articulate an America First policy, moving away from a largely globalist agenda. Do you think those intervening variables matter at all, or is this primarily an America that is looking at its larger global role and coming to terms with its decline?
Yeah, and the way you phrase that question is precisely the way, if there's a methodology to the book, that I've constructed it, which is, of course, history does not connect with straight lines from eras in the 17th and 18th century to 21st century debates. Of course, more proximate events and structural circumstances are why the world unfolds in the way that it does. What I'm interested in is, rather than saying the imperial legacies are the dominant or the sole cause or influencing factor in modern day conundrums, I want to somewhat apportion the relative importance they do have, and also try to uncover where the imperial era's influence is now so much part of our everyday understanding of the situation, we don't even see it anymore. Because as historians of empire tend to agree, the world's history was a history of empires, right? Since the Akkadian Empire, the old Middle Eastern empires from Mesopotamia, more or less until the 20th century, direct occupation, conquest, like Putin attempted and succeeded in Crimea, that's now rare. That was the rule of the political road, and it stopped. And that stop is a seismic, I think, change. In relation to America, I'm very aware that in some countries there is a conscious appeal or realization of the imperial past. In other countries it's subconscious because there's a degree of denial. America, as you have insinuated in your question, is very much in the subconscious. It's there if you look hard enough, but it's not part of the everyday rhetoric. That because of the conundrum embedded in the American psyche, its birth in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence this is a repudiation of colonialism and of empire. We break away from the British, the 13 colonies forged their own path. But at the same time, the way the federal government later started to expand its control over the North American continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast, was in effect imperial. The dispossession of Native Americans, the sweeping aside of sympathizers to the old loyalist position in terms of the old Civil War legacies, how those loyal to the British Crown fled to Canada, how the Canada-US border was still a subject of contestation, how the Lewis and Clark exploration that went across to map the cartography of the United States, some of that evidence was cited in disputes with Canada over the border. All of this stuff is foundational to the United States. The United States is hewn from the rocks of imperial competition. The French and the Spanish intervened against the British to allow for the 13 colonies and the patriots to actually break free. To implications for the Trump era, I think. I've seen it written that the two countries around the world that are the most consequential for America's immediate fate is Mexico and China. And when you take the issue of imperial legacies and their relative influence to mind, when you put it to mind, both of these conundrums start to appear, I think, more comprehensible in terms of the depth of the disputes that are happening. The Mexico-America war, just to begin on that subject, that created clearly the border that now exists. It also meant that the annexation of places like Texas is still, it's 19th century, it's not that long ago that the United States took its shape. We take it for granted because there's almost no one alive now who doesn't remember American primacy. And we keep saying America is a young country, but it's 250 odd years that it's existed, and it's accrued a large number of enmities and questions that people might forge a different answer to than Donald Trump and what I can describe as an Anglo-Saxon American orthodoxy around the identification of white Americans and therefore the settlers' descendants, the original European settlers' descendants, as the core of the nation. In the chapter, I cite the demographic evidence we have of how Hispanic America is becoming, how Spanish is becoming a competing language to English in many parts, and maybe over the course of our lifetimes will actually overtake English. This speaks to an imperial past. This speaks to a notion that perhaps the Mexican might look at this threat to build a wall, forcing Mexico to pay for it, and think, well, so far the advantage is with you, America, but actually the demographics are going to turn, the cultural connections will extend. These are quite acutely important questions for domestic American politics. And I'll pause in relation to China, because I think we may have a chance to talk about that later on, but certainly what America did in the 20th century was it reinvented the notion of empire, from formal empire to, as you've suggested, an informal empire in which it can use bases and it can operate through territories, whether, for example, this is a temporary pact with Pakistan after 9/11 to operate through in its territory to wage war in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda. It doesn't need to annex the territory. The British tried to annex that territory, and of course they did. The Northwest Frontier Province has its name precisely because of that reason. The Americans are looking for bases rather than colonies. And even now, the Department of Defense is looking perhaps less for bases, more for places that you can have a pact with. You can use their landing strip, their port, without necessarily having to have a status of forces agreement in the traditional way. So it's an informal empire based on outposts. And this vision is now colliding directly with China's own vision of an informal empire, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. Two different reimaginings of how you can exert power without the ability and the desire to formally annex territories, which is, of course, the way the world worked until just a couple of generations ago.
Samir, this raises a very interesting question, because you always have this relationship between the empire builders and the recipients in that process. So and in particular with regard to America, because we have had this debate now about how much of a global engagement should America have? This is not simply a question for Americans to talk about, but everyone else outside also seems to have a stake in this conversation, right? We all want America to be there and not to be there at the same time. There is a lot of consternation when Americans, for example, argue, oh, they are leaving Afghanistan. All the regional countries, or at least those who are favorably disposed to America, start complaining that America should not leave, or this will lead to chaos. America leaving Middle East will lead to chaos. American presence has been a force for stability. Even in the Pacific, for example, the idea that America might retrench from the Pacific is a cause of great concern in many ways to a lot of those who you can argue are the recipients of the empire of the American empire. So when you look at this conversation at a meta level, from at a worldwide level, what are one or two salient things that you would see, because you have mapped out the world in terms of the imperial imaginations, almost. So when you're looking at this conversation happening between those like America trying to have an informal empire and those who are conflicted about the nature of American imperialism, what emerges as the most salient aspect of this conversation to you as someone who is studying imperialism and its consequences?
Yeah, I'd say first salient observation is a degree of sympathy for Americans, which is you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And we've seen that with the global outrage around the Iraq War, 2002 to 3 in the build-up, and the fact that this is still the principal piece of evidence that all sorts of people use, including some Americans, to argue against the ruinous nature of unending foreign commitments. Donald Trump himself uses some of these arguments to talk about why, as I think he said, with Syria, there's only blood and sand for us, therefore we should not intervene and punish Bashar al-Assad. Then when it came to the failure to intervene decisively at the right time in Syria, this is under the Obama administration, at the time the Syrian civil war worsened, Americans were then sort of being asked, well, where are you? And then the Russians stepped in with a much more overtly cynical intervention, picking the other side, and the rest is unfortunately history in terms of the way that conflict has unfolded. So there's some sympathy for the Americans. There is, I think, as well, the other salient point in terms of the world's perception of America's engagement or lack of, is, I think, a failure to come to terms with what empire means in the 21st century, because it has fallen out of fashion as a piece of terminology. We don't have a vocabulary with which to readily describe what it means to garrison parts of the world, what it means to have a Pax Americana in the way that the British and the Romans attempted to achieve some sort of bubbles of peace and prosperity on their own terms, admittedly, and reflecting a degree of grandiose vanity, because there is an act of vanity in stationing your armed forces in different frontier provinces and saying we're here to safeguard a world order, and in the Americans' case, commercial practice and domestic political practices that mirror image reflect some of the things we take for granted and hold dear to ourselves. We understand this to be the key to unlocking human productivity and a degree of human happiness. That's contestable, Fukuyama, so on and so forth, but that's the overriding motivation. We don't have a vocabulary. And I'd also locate some of the blame at the doorstep of the Americans for why we don't have this vocabulary. We're all of the generation that we remember, unfortunate pop culture reference, but please forgive me, that the Star Wars trilogy was based against the Galactic Empire, and all of the Imperial officers had British accents, which is no accident in itself, because it reflected a 1970s sense of America, thinking itself as futuristic and moving forward, and this sort of British colonial officer class being something that was what the Americans broke away from in 1776 and 1783, when the War of Independence was won. So America has had not an empire by stealth, but an informal empire. It's shorn away any sense of imperial narrative around the way it's done this, and there is really no uniting, compelling myth remaining, I think, to rhetorically explain why America is deployed around the world. It's interesting if Biden wins the presidency and he starts to restore US alliances in a more conventional way, what sort of rebooted narrative there will be for an American global presence? Because we know the Cold War provided justification to stand up against communism. We know that the post-Cold War period was that sense of America spreading in its view, prosperity of globalized networks. And we know that the war on terror extended those narratives in relation to American self-defense and partnerships around terrorism. I really feel that that post 9/11 cycle is coming to an end. Not that terrorism isn't an end, but it's 20 years now. I've been, as I'm sure you have been, teaching students who don't remember 9/11, 18, 19-year-olds now, and this is really sobering. I was an undergraduate at the time in 2001, but it's clear that half a generation has passed, if not 2/3 of a generation. What will the American narrative be to justify its global presence? And I suspect it won't be any more imaginative than China is an autocracy. Autocracy is bad, and therefore we must unite as democracies. Perhaps it will be as simple as that.
So when I'll come to Asia very quickly, but before I come to the Indo-Pacific or Asia to the east, let me touch upon the other part of the West, which is, and you I think juxtapose European Union and Britain very, very interestingly, because here is a case of EU almost trying to move towards a post-colonial phase of trying to pool sovereignty in some ways. which is quite, from Europe's perspective, very, very interesting given where they were coming from. But also Britain, I think the issues that you touch upon, whether it's Brexit, whether it is this desire to be independent or autonomy, whether it is Iraq war, for example, and the role that Britain played. All of these issues, if you can speak to us about how do you see them coming from, say, Brussels and London? How do you, if one were looking at this issue from a vantage point of how far European Union has come, and given the tensions that have emerged in recent years, even in Europe, what how it speaks to some of the perpetual constraints in Europe, again coming from that imperial legacy itself, whereas in Britain it has taken a different turn with Brexit and with this desire to have greater control over decision making, perhaps mythical, but I think a very real desire in certain constituencies in Britain to have greater degree of autonomy. So how do you juxtapose these two experiences?
When I was starting off doing the research, there's the book by Robert Kaplan, who I'm a big fan of, called Monsoon, which many viewers in Asia will be very aware of. He had a sort of a throwaway comment, which absolutely, as he often does, completely nails it, which is we're entering a world of less Western-dominated world of astonishing interdependence and yet ferociously guarded sovereignty. And this is such a contradiction that Britain and Europe is experiencing now, is that clearly globalization and interdependence means that no nation is an island, and yet these appeals to sometimes mythical national pasts and resurgent nationalism runs directly in contradiction, which is almost an element of autarky, of self-sufficiency, around how we then want to realize the way that we do our business and run our lives. The other thing to say with regards to the EU and Britain is, when I've written this book, I've got no sense of predetermined destiny around imperial legacies. I think every set of imperial legacies is different. They're interpreted differently by the people under the spotlight. And in relation to the European Union, there is, of course, a legacy in the distant past of the Roman Empire, and then the Byzantine Empire as its successor in the East, and the Holy Roman Empire as its sort of impermanent, somewhat patchy successor in the Germanic territories and in the West. We know, of course, that Europe has never been united, and that since the fall of the Roman Empire, there has only been increasing divisions. But we also know that Europe's history is unfathomable without two imperial stories. One is the attempts to unify Europe, whether it's conquerors like Napoleon or Charles V, and Europe's colonial adventures abroad. And so what I say is that the European Union, it's of course a post-imperial project. It's not an imperial project in its own self-image. But whether it likes it or not, it is following after these two very different sets of legacies. And some of the conundrums that it faces around how it's perceived outside of its own territories, when it's giving advice, when it's suggesting that democracy is the way forward and sending election observers, passing comment on other countries' lack of democracy. There is a legacy of Europeans telling others what to do. I don't think it's nefarious now, but the European Union is fairly convinced that its understanding of the modern world is the right one. It doesn't necessarily want to be lectured. And just this weekend, in fact, Harsh, there was a very interesting op-ed written by the EU foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, and it appeared in Le Journal du Dimanche on Sunday. And here's what he said, probably coinciding with the Chinese foreign minister's visits to France, I think, around this time. He said, Russia, China, and Turkey share some common characteristics. Their sovereignist vision has regained the upper hand with these new empires. And he's using empire as a term of insult, because the way that these countries respectively have organized themselves domestically, it runs in such stark contention to the way the Western Europeans have organized themselves, that it clearly shows that there are different lessons that can be learned from the end of the imperial era. In relation to Brexit and Britain, very quickly, I think the European Union is, I think, at risk of not really acknowledging how empire-like some of its challenges actually are. So it doesn't rule by force, it doesn't annex territory, it says it's voluntary. I do still wonder the extent to which in accession negotiations, a smaller Eastern European country has actually got any leverage at all in relation to Brussels. I also doubt very much that Eastern European culture is influencing Western European countries. I think it's more or less seen the other way, which is there is a transfer of wealth to the former Soviet bloc countries. There is a sort of bringing them up to the level, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But I do think that there is a possibility of interpreting EU expansion as the Western European countries creating a larger buffer zone for themselves, which is not what they intend. But we know in international politics, it's not about what you intend, it's how what you do is perceived, and about the second and third order consequences of what's happening. And it's unquestionable to me that the European Union is attempting something that has not really been achieved before. And that's the union, effectively, of what was called Christendom. That's why Turkey's EU accession was never likely to be on the cards. That's why it starts to peter out when Western European notions of Christendom meet Orthodox Christianity and the power center that emanates from Moscow. These historical and imperially drawn points of demarcation in terms of where influence, power, and culture spread and extend to are still being played out today, albeit in a 21st century post-imperial perspective. I didn't talk about Brexit, but I'll pause myself there on Europe.
Let me take you to the Indo-Pacific, or to the East now, and some would say that has become the center of gravity of global politics, global economics. There is so much happening. Major powers are rising. In particular, China's rise, of course, is the big story of our times, and how that is shaping the global order. You have touched upon that in the context of America and a perception of a relative American decline. But when we look at China today, it's a remarkable transformation, but also a huge challenge. Again, a perception that China is more interested in an aggressive pursuit of its geopolitical interests than in building a global order where others might have a stake. That has been a constant complaint. Now, Chinese, of course, have their own version of how they interpret their own history, their centuries of humiliation, that whole idea of Middle Kingdom, from where it emanates. So when you look at Chinese policies today, and when you try to interpret them through historical lens, what are two or three things that we should be aware of when we are responding at a global level, when we are trying to respond to that challenge, or at a bilateral level, say a country like India or Vietnam or Japan, when they're trying to have a bilateral conversation with the Chinese? I think that is a very important point, perhaps not only for these bilateral relationships, but also the bigger point for the larger global order as to how do you respond to this challenge of China that also uses or tends to use imperialism or imperial memory at times for instrumental purposes. And I'm sure China is not the only country that does that, but the spotlight is on China at the moment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Everybody, consciously or subconsciously, draws upon their histories. They do. I think the Chinese are doing it quite consciously and actually for their purposes quite effectively. Three observations, Harsh. First on history, secondly on autocracy, and third on Hong Kong. I think this will allow us to explore some of those themes. Of course, the most proximate historical experience is the rise of the Communist Party, the end of the century of humiliation, as they date it to 1949. As ever, I'm more interested in this book of looking at the longer backstory, which is the many centuries of Chinese imperial power waxing and waning, and the different dynasties, and how that has influenced China's conception of itself. Because obviously we can't predict how the CCP will evolve, but I think it will in equal parts draw from its communist and its prior imperial Chinese history backstories, and probably increasingly from the latter, the more distant past. Because the thing that's always striking is that Mao's success in the Chinese Civil War was to actually re-establish the frontiers of what was quite clearly Qing imperial Chinese frontiers. The map of China from the 18th century to the 20th century didn't really ultimately change that much. There were changes, of course, but it didn't lose half its territory. This is not post-Ottoman Turkey, where the contraction in Anatolia was stark, and Ataturk's vision for a republican Turkish state was unrecognizable to the Ottoman Empire. Ideologically, Mao is unrecognizable to the Chinese emperors who precede him. But in terms of the challenge of managing this vast estate, there are some similarities, I think, that were imposed upon the Chinese Communist Party that we would do well to continue to remind ourselves of. So that's the first point, which history should we look back to. The second point is on autocracy, because as I mentioned earlier, I think, I get the impression the Americans and the British are at the edge of their seats waiting for more evidence of Chinese evil intent, whatever the issue, because the Americans and the British always want a moral case to be mounted to justify strong positions or interventions, perhaps. This is a part of their own imperial legacies as well, the feeling as if they occupy a moral high ground. I'm not judging it, but I think it's hard to deny that there is an element of we are crusading against autocracy as impelling a lot of American intervention. With my chapter and with this book, I wanted to put my own thoughts and biases aside and try and look at it from this country's own perspective. What would its elite say? And we can access this through translated academic material, through examining the way in which its statesmen speak. And I spent quite a lot of time on how Chinese conceptions of the moral virtue of autocracy and strong central rule flow from its interpretation of its own imperial history. In particular, rather than describing it as conquest, the Chinese translated narrative is of unification and of disunity as being the great embarrassment and the great shame and the great problem causer in imperial Chinese history. A couple of pieces of evidence that I drew upon to come to that conclusion. One of which was a very happy afternoon spent going through the Chinese National Museum in Beijing and taking notes as I went as to how the different Chinese dynasties were presented. And of course, the narrative is very much present focused in line with CCP objectives to indoctrinate the population. But secession and disunity and civil war were the great points of pain. And there are different periods in Chinese imperial history that this speaks to. I also read a translated copy of The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is one of China's great literary works, written significantly after the events that it describes, but again, alluding back to a particular historical period in which there was a great deal of internecine warfare between different warlords. We know that, and you and I will know, teaching at King's, teaching war studies and defense studies, Sun Tzu, the environment within which he wrote The Art of War was the Warring States period of around 400, 300 BCE. He was writing at a time when China was riven by war. All of this means that secession and any attempt at disunity is frowned upon because it's not seen as the gateway to a harmonious and balanced and peaceful and prosperous present. I think it's going to be quite hard to mount rhetorical arguments against something that's that deeply and historically ingrained, both in Chinese propaganda, but also in its interpretation of its own imperial history, to say that multi-party politics is better, that freedom of speech is better. They'll say, well, look at the chaos around Brexit and Donald Trump. Look who you elected, America. How dare you lecture us? And this brings me to the third point of my observations of Hong Kong. Because we know, everyone knows, this is the arena within which those arguments, those clashes are playing out right now. And the primary imperial legacies clearly are British and the handover in 1997. But it's also, I think Joshua Wong, the very young Hong Kong protester, I think he said that Hong Kong is as if it's a child born of white parents, but now being returned to its white foster parents, raised by them, but being returned to its Asian parents. Its habits have grown in a different way. No one is going to give ground in relation to the arguments around Hong Kong, not the British, not the Americans, not those Hong Kongers like Joshua Wong and people of his generation, maybe some older, who are completely bought into the virtues of freedom of speech and a degree of autonomy from the Chinese mainland. But the Chinese formulation of governance, of effective governance, of discipline, of fealty to the greater power is also unshakable. And ultimately the gestures that have been made by the Americans and the British to censure the Chinese tightening with its national security law, it is China's backyard. And as I sort of say to myself, if in Britain the Isle of Wight, just off the south coast of the UK, had at some point been colonized by the Chinese and turned into an autocracy, but then it was handed back on the guarantee it remained an autocracy for 50 years after handover, it's unlikely that people with itchy feet in London wouldn't start to agitate for a mirror imaging of their own political values in this almost contiguous island space. It's not a very good analogy, but I think we need to, before there's a World War III, of course, let alone any serious confrontations with China, of course India knows about this, is to understand why the intransigence exists, why other elites are not persuadable, why other populations are sometimes not persuadable, and why countries can be placed upon on collision courses with each other, both seeking equal justification from their own interpretations of history as to why it is that they are right.
That brings us to India, Samir. You touched upon India in the context of China, but I think your chapter does something very interesting because it looks at the entire trajectory from Nehru to Modi, and that is a good juxtaposition in some ways, not only because of the personalities of these two prime ministers, not only their articulations of different visions of India, but I think in some ways, this is also about India changing its own idea of itself. So in a sense, there used to be a time when it was the idea of India. Today, there are multiple ideas of India, perhaps, roaming around and trying to contest with each other, have a contestation with each other. So in a sense, and here I would like you to talk both in terms of how you perceive this domestic shift, but as well as, also perhaps if you can talk to us about how do you perceive the foreign policy shift? Because you mentioned that in terms of non-alignment, where non-alignment became, an idea that allowed Indian policymakers to reclaim their legacy from imperial past. Say that, look, we want to be sovereign. We don't want to be, we want to retain our autonomy, and therefore we won't side with either of the two power blocks. And now when you look at India, it's a very different conception. And in the context of China that you have talked about, that India and China, of course, are competing also with each other, not only with the West. So there is that element here, which is intra-Asian historical memory, which is shaping their own futures and their attempt to shape their own futures. And so, in terms of foreign policy, I study foreign policy, so it would be interesting to see, for example, how far in the other direction India moves from non-alignment, given the challenge with China is very real, and given that the relationship with America has improved, given that people are already talking about a very close alignment between America and India. So what does that mean in terms of this colonial arc that you have sort of presented from Nehru to Modi? Is it simply a reflection of this shift, or is there something more fundamental happening there?
Yeah, the question of India's evolution is another example of, if we were sitting here 5 years ago and somebody told us that India would look like this, or 6 years ago before Modi, you wouldn't really have believed it necessarily, because India has evolved in a way that is less recognizable to people who took the assumptions of the 1980s and 1990s, I think, to heart, even if the BJP did have a spell in power earlier. And I should also add that the histories I provide in my book, they're more or less summaries, but moving from that 1947 to 2014-15 period, what I posit domestically, before coming to the foreign policy question, is that, of course, any Indian politician and the whole Indian public lives in the shadow of the age of empires, because we all do to a certain extent. What I thought was an interesting line to explore is that the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, long so dominant, almost monopolistic at times in its dominance of Indian politics and Indian political discourse, reflected one set of very particular post-imperial interpretations, And I was actually really keen to look at the BJP and Modi as providing an alternative. They're not talking about the British Empire, but of course they're speaking to the issues that India still has psychologically and materially as being the product of successive Mughal and British legacies. Quite directly, the Savarkar book, Hindutva, which was very short, so it's very easy to pick up and read a copy. I was really interested to find out that his earlier book was called The Indian War of Independence, 1857. He wrote this in 1909, so about 14 or 15 years before he wrote the Hindutva book, which he's much more famous for. But of course, you look at his birthday, he's born in 1883, died in the 60s. Of course, he lived that independence period, he lived with the burning anger of wanting to break away from what was by then a very constrictive existence under a British Empire that's losing its slip. It's not surprising that some of the Hindutva's text relates to a mythical Indian past that was free of conquerors, free of oppressors. And it's also not so surprising then to read M.S. Golwalkar, who of course was an RSS ideologue in the mid-20th century, writing about the necessity of wiping out all signs that remind us of our past slavery and humiliation, talking about both Mughal, Muslim, and British imperial dominance. The outcome of that is not that the current Modi government is reading these texts and writing its policies. They are, of course, highly influential. I think the outcome is that the vision of a majoritarian Hindu India is one that's, one would assume, is seen as being less corrupted by the influence of foreigners, because it's speaking to what it sees as being authentically Indian. Now, I think that is highly debatable, because, of course, there have been influxes and influences, even back down to this debate around whether the original Aryan people were indigenous or whether they arrived from somewhere else. This, of course, was another debate that played out in Indian newspapers, as well as amongst Indian curators of museums and archaeological evidence. The outcome of all of this is a search in the Modi government for a national story that is free from less influenced by external factors, that is more directable in relation to Indian pride in a notion of what it means to be Indian and autonomously or authentically Indian, however fallacious those illusions might be. The contradiction, I think, in foreign policy terms is this. It's been described that India is the great swing state in Asia in relation to the US-China confrontation. India is the most important other country by far. It will be the most populous country in the world within our lifetimes, I think, in the next few decades. It has so much economic potential still to fulfill. It has a lot of military potential still to fulfill. All the questions I'm sure that you look at on a sort of a monthly basis, weekly basis. The contradiction is, if the Americans want a stronger India that throws its weight around a bit more, that Modi's vision may actually be one of the paths towards that. That's, again, not necessarily a good outcome. But I'm wondering what it would take for India to break out of the non-alignment mode of thinking. And the non-alignment mode of thinking I found, and I think is evident when you read about the Cold War experience. It's as much about the practical recovery from empire as it is the attitudinal recovery from empire. It's about trying not to be sucked up into the USSR or the United States rival Cold War camps. It's about being, striking India's own path. But it never seemed to actually then amount to striking India's own path to decisively influence its immediate region. There are a few attempts in a disastrous intervention in the Sri Lankan civil war, which resulted in Rajiv Gandhi's assassination. But there was never really, correct me if I'm wrong, never really an Indian foreign policy vision for the region in which India drives the region. And I don't think Modi is there, nor is Modi actually going to be there in the foreseeable future. But one wonders whether India will still largely maintain a focus that is within its own borders with some degree of influence externally, or whether it will actually want to more decisively involve itself in these great power contests, and what it would take for India to psychologically and materially be in a position to do that. And whether when the Americans come knocking again, as they will continuously in the next few years, there's an India that is willing to provide quite limited trade-related and maybe military basing and military cooperation-related assistance, or whether there's an India that's willing to actually take a much more forward position. But then again, maybe the clash with China, as it's just happened this year, might be one of the things that moves India, shakes India a little bit out of that complacency. Nonetheless, I still think there are some imperial legacies to behold in the way in which these debates, I think, psychologically and attitudinally unfold within India.
Samir, I think we have covered the entire world, and we are almost at the end of our time. But I think the point that you make about every single of these cases is we are at the end, nations are largely a product of the stories that they tell themselves about themselves. So in a sense, this imperial legacy, the narratives that surround these legacies has shaped the contours of most of these entities, whether it is America today or China of today or European Union, Britain, and India itself. And there are many other cases in your book, in particular Middle East and Africa, that one could have talked about. But we are just running out of time. So thank you so much for this wonderful interaction. And anything you want to say when we, at the very end of this very, very interesting conversation?
Yeah, just two things. Firstly, to thank you again, really sincerely to you, Harsh, and the RF for this wonderful conversation. It's a real pleasure to take part. And the last comment, just for anyone thinking about picking up the book, it really is a spur to allow you to form your own opinions. Don't take my opinions and my judgments, my analysis about these different parts of the world. They're just my own opinions. But it's about the terms within which our opinions actually unfold, where our points of reference are, and why it is that certain people can become utterly intransigent when it comes to this linkage between the stories we tell ourselves, our sense of personal identity, and then how our countries conduct themselves on the international stage. It's really that simple as a premise, but then ever so complicated when it comes to trying to understand how the implications of those imperial stories play out.
Thank you, Samir. Thank you. Wonderful to have you once, and all the best with this book.